Hey, Sam from Folk of All Trades here. Just while we're waiting for a few people to join us, I wanted to show you compost actually in the garden setting. So I've got some beautiful cabbages growing here, and before I planted those, we spread out compost on the top to a sort of depth of about 5 centimeters, and it's doing a really good job of feeding them. They look super happy and healthy, and it's also protecting the soil, increasing that organic matter, moisture holding capacity. It's just the best stuff going around. Let's compare it over here to an area that hasn't been composted since spring last year. These are actually hops that grow in this bed, and you can see the soil is much drier. It doesn't look anywhere near as dark and rich. It really needs a good feed, and so before this starts growing again in spring, I'll give it a really good, nice, again 5, maybe even up to 10 centimeter layer, and that'll see these hops through all the way to next autumn. So yeah, I just cannot speak highly enough for compost. If you weren't convinced already, hopefully that's given you another reason. Let's go over and actually look at some composting setup. Cool. So hopefully a few people have joined us by now. I'm Sam from Folk of All Trades. Behind the camera is Danny, who's my partner and also camera person for today, and a question reader. So if you've got questions, then please pop them in the comments, and then Danny can refer them to me. I may not answer them straight away because I've got so much to cover, but I will try and come back to them if I don't. So the first thing I want to do is say thanks to our sponsors for today, Resilient South, so that's City of Mitcham, Onkaparinga, Marion and Holdfast Bay, and also the Adelaide and Mount Lofty Ranges Natural Resources Management Board. And today is a really special day actually. It's the first day of Reconciliation Week, and the theme for Reconciliation Week this year is we're in it together, which is just perfect I think for this time. And today is all about acknowledgement and acknowledging country. So I want to acknowledge that I'm here on Kaurna land, Kaurna Yarta, which was never ceded, it was stolen. And I want to say Ngankina Merina Namarni, Marni Ngadlu, Tampiti Ngadlu, Kaurna Yatanka Imperendi. It's good to acknowledge we're meeting on Kaurna land, even if it is digitally. So yes, we're here to talk about composting at home. It's a subject that's very dear to my heart. I think of it as kind of fermentation that's happening outside. I do a lot of fermentation in the kitchen, and you'll see there's a lot of similarities between cooking and fermentation and what happens out here in the compost area. So that's pretty cool. I'm going to be talking about mostly the system that I use, which is a cold composting closed bin system. I'd love to hear what system you're using at home, if you are, or if you're using the green bins that council provides. So please comment away, let me know, and I'll also ask you later to tell me what kind of things you compost, but hold off for now. So I thought it'd be a good idea to cover some theory, because no matter what composting system you're using, we're pretty much adhering to the same general principles, the ideas that ensure a really good compost. Now, you can't stop composting if you want to. I mean, I guess you could dry everything out so much that it just won't do anything, but composting is a completely natural process. You could just shove everything in a pile and it will eventually break down. What we're trying to do is sort of mimic that natural process, control it, keep it a bit more neat and tidy and speed it up, because we want it to happen as quickly as possible. So as I said, completely natural process. Anything that was once alive can be composted, and that's going to be the mantra of today. Anything that was once alive can be composted. So that brings us to Adam. I'd love to know if you know Adam, if you've heard of Adam before, a really nice mnemonic device for remembering how compost works. And it's really helpful to me, and especially when I'm explaining to people the things that are most important to keep in mind. The first one, that aliveness. So I think of that in 2 ways. So not only is the compost alive, it's a living thing, and so it needs what living things need. It needs moisture and food and energy sources. But it's also good to remember that anything that was once alive can be composted. So those are the 2 aspects. Diversity is super important. Basically, just like us, the broader range of foods that we consume, the more healthy we will be, and most of the composts that I see that are going wrong, it's usually because there's too much of one thing in there. And so a lot of, I call them composting myths that you see around as well, like, oh, you can't compost meat, you can't compost dairy, you can't compost oranges. You absolutely can compost all those things. They're just so rich, you can only use a small amount of them compared to the other stuff. So we'll get into more detail about what you can and can't compost in just a minute. But yeah, know that the broader range of stuff that you can feed your compost, the happier it will be. So that's diversity. And I will use a bit of a technical aspect. This is something that people sometimes find a little bit difficult, but there's carbon and there's nitrogen. And those are the two, broadly speaking, big categories of what we put in our compost bin. Sometimes called browns and greens. That can be a little bit confusing because a lot of nitrogen-rich material are actually brown. Like, you know, coffee grounds is a classic one. Even though it looks brown, it's really high in nitrogen. So the basic thing to remember is for every bucket of nitrogen-rich materials, so that's green materials or, you know, materials that are food scraps and other things like that, you need at least sort of three buckets of carbon-rich materials. And it can be a bit tricky because sometimes things are bulkier than others, but the basic idea is that you just need heaps more carbon than you do nitrogen. And so a lot of people's composts I see, they're a real slimy, stinky mess, and that's because they're just putting way too much nitrogen in. It's out of balance, and so that diversity you need to maintain, and you also need to layer it like a lasagna. So there's a nice little cooking metaphor. We'll come back to lasagna later. So that's diversity. The other thing is we want to keep it aerated. So this is an aerobic system that's happening. That means in the presence of oxygen. Anaerobic means without oxygen. That's when things are really squished and, you know, no air can get in, and you get some really stinky things happening. So lots of sulfur and other things are produced, and it's not a pleasure to be around. And so you want a lot of aeration in there, and the best way to do that is really to put in carbon materials. So putting in the things that I'll get into, cardboards and newspaper and straw and things like that, just so there's enough air in the mix. So that's aeration. And the final one is moisture. So, you know, you can have too much moisture, you can have too little moisture. You really want to find that Goldilocks zone in the middle. You see in every composting book this really funny phrase, as wet as a wrung out sponge. So that's, I don't know, it's kind of a funny way to think about it because you don't necessarily grab your compost and squeeze it, but it's kind of a good term of reference. Basically, if you did squeeze it, you would want little beads of moisture to form on it, but you wouldn't want the moisture to run down your arms because that'd be disgusting and it would be too much moisture. So the way that I sort of get around that to making sure there's enough moisture is I just add a little bit of water, little and often, rather than trying to add a heap down the line when it's sort of too late. So that's the theory. Feel free to ask questions as we go, but I just want to talk through the way that I actually use my compost bin, and I'll talk about the things that I put in it as well, and the things that I avoid putting in it. So as I mentioned, we've got a 2-bin system here, closed system. These recycled plastic bins are really, really common in South Australia. They're called, the brand name is Gedye, G-E-D-Y-E, Gedye bins. Sometimes they're called Daleks because of the shape. This is the sort of regular size. You can get ones that are a bit bigger. What I really like about them is that they're a good size. Composting works best when it's a decent volume. Too small and it can't really get to work. There's not enough microorganisms going on. There's not enough heat retention. It gets quite cold. So these are a good size. They keep quite a lot of things that would otherwise want to spread your compost around and eat your compost. They keep those out. So things like birds would just love to get in there and throw stuff around. And certainly you see that if there's an open bin compost-based system, you get birds in there flicking stuff around. They do also keep mice out if you do a couple of key things. So you can either dig your bin down into the ground a little bit, but mice are very, very good tunnelers, and particularly in the middle of winter, they want somewhere warm to have a nest, so they will try and get in. What I've found to really be quite useful, and Danny's going to come in and show you, I think, is to put quite a fine mesh underneath the bin. And I used to take that off and put it back on every time. You know, I'd slip the bin off because it makes it a bit easier, but I'm basically too lazy to do that now, and I just leave them on there permanently. So I've just placed them on once, I've bent the edges around, so it's really, really nice and sealed, and I do not get rodents inside the compost bin anymore, which is great because, you know, they get into the garden and cause other issues. So that's my top tip for keeping mice and rodents out, and one of the benefits of these closed bin systems. So basically what happens is I've got an active bin. Think of this as bin number 1, and that's where everything goes in. So this one's almost full now, but I just wanted to show you when I come out with my food scrap bucket. This lives in the kitchen under the sink. It's a sealed bucket because, you know, sometimes we throw things in, you know, bits of soup and, you know, wet stuff, so it doesn't cause any leakages. And you can see it's not lined. I don't have anything in there. Some people like to put newspaper just to keep it a bit cleaner. I just tend to wash it out every now and again. And the kinds of things I put in there are basically anything that's a byproduct of the kitchen. So this is actually a houseplant leaf that a cat knocked off. You know, banana skins, eggshells, tromboncino skins, pumpkin skins, this poor persimmon that's just absolute mush, too much for me, unfortunately. And then, of course, your coffee grounds, and basically anything that you can think of that that is a byproduct of the kitchen. We also did quite a lot of shelling of beans the other day, so this sort of papery material that was around the beans, that's really good. So sort of 95% of that stuff is really nitrogen rich. I mean, everything has both nitrogen and carbon in it. These are probably fairly carbon rich now. You know, they've lost a lot of moisture, it's gone dry, so I would sort of think of that as carbon. But basically I throw in my nitrogen rich materials, including oranges. You know, if I juiced 50 oranges, then I might think, oh, that's a lot to just put in one layer. You know, particularly worms don't really like citrus, but worms aren't the only things that are going on there. There's fungi, there's bacteria, there's protozoa. It's a whole crazy world in there, and the other things will break that down, and the worms can sort of avoid it till it's nicely composted. So I come out, I've dumped my food scraps in there, and then what I tend to do immediately, because otherwise, you know, that's my beautiful one layer of lasagna. Think of that as the cheese, you know, quite a wet, rich layer. I need to put my pasta sheets, I need to put my carbon rich material in there. So something people often have access to is newspaper. I picked up a whole bundle of these because I like to use them for composting and sheet mulching. Now, the best way to use newspaper in your compost is to make it small. So my top tip is to peel it or rip it from the spine downwards. If you try and rip it in the other direction, you get tiny little bits coming off, or this is the grain is running this way. So it can be quite a fun thing to do with kids, actually. You know, who can do the thinnest, longest strip of newspaper. Some people are a little bit concerned about the inks. So it used to be that there was some really nasty stuff in ink that they use on newspaper, but now they use soy-based ink in, you know, almost all newspapers. I haven't yet come across one that doesn't use it in South Australia. So so that's fine to go into the compost, and you really just have to make sure there's not these shiny inserts that are sometimes in newspapers. You know, your magazines, they don't really go into compost because it's essentially been covered in plastic. So I tend to avoid using that. Other things that are carbon rich are, of course, straw. So you can get bales of bedding straw, you know, for pretty cheap. If you've got chooks, then, you know, you can use the straw in their area first. They're scratching around it, they soil it, and then that can go into the compost. So, you know, adding a bit of that. Manure is another really good thing to add to your compost. This is horse manure that, you know, we drive past a place down here on the Flurio. Lots of people have horses, up in the Adelaide Hills as well. So we often buy a few bags of manure, and the person reuses these old brewing bags, which is kind of nice. And so in general, manure is considered a nitrogen-rich thing, but because particularly for horses, they eat so much grass, and a lot of it just passes through undigested. I kind of think of it as a carbon source. There you go. Some people are grossed out, I'm sure, but you can basically see I've just broken one of the peds open, one of the horse poos, and it's essentially all grass. There's a little bit of goodness in there, but I find that really good to balance things out. You will see that it's quite dry. You know, it's probably sat out in the paddock for a little while and done a little bit of composting, and then it's sat in a bag and lost moisture. So all of these things are generally pretty dry, and that's why I have water to sort of top up that moisture, and I always add my nitrogen layer, then I add my carbon layer, and then I add water in that order. So that's really good for keeping down pests as well. Vinegar flies are a really common one to have in your compost. They love to feast on, you know, your fruit scraps and all that kind of thing. If you cover it immediately with a carbon layer and then water it in, you really won't have a problem with vinegar flies. So of course it's not just stuff from the kitchen that you can put into your compost. You know, this is an eggplant that I just ripped out because, you know, it's completely done. I need to plant something else there now. So for something like this, I might just pull off the leaves. You know, I'm not too worried about stuff like that. Bendy stems, they're okay to go in, they'll break down nicely. What won't break down as nicely is these really woody stems. You know, they've been growing for 6 months now. They're super tough. And so what I like to do, and you know, this is because I'm a really keen composter. If you couldn't be bothered with that, you know, you just take off the leaves and then you put that in your green bin. What I often do is take an axe or a hammer and just sort of break up the fibers a bit, because you're creating lots and lots of surface area, and that just helps it break down. So not everyone can be bothered doing that, I know, but I'm just trying to keep as much of that goodness that gets produced on the property here. One thing that I won't put into my compost that, you know, does grow here, we've got a mulberry tree just behind Danny, sits in the neighbour's yard and overhangs, and the mulberry prunings, you know, they're really, really woody. Even though they're only sort of less than a finger thickness, I'd only put that into the compost if I was going to break it into essentially tiny little pieces, and I just don't have the energy for that. So that goes into the green bin, you know, or to the local green waste depot to be commercially composted, because commercial composters can do a lot more than we can do with sort of these low temperature cold composting. This might get up to sort of 50 degrees if we're lucky, whereas they get up to 70, 80 degrees, you know, and it's being turned and mulched and lots of tiny little pieces. So other things that I tend not to put into this kind of compost are, you know, the bio cup stuff, the compostable coffee cups and things like that. They tend to have a coating on them, which is biodegradable compostable, but you know, it's not necessarily something that's going to easily break down in my compost bin at home. Same thing with these plant plastics, you know, sometimes made out of byproducts or corn starch, things like that. We do use the compostable bags, but we tend to use those for things like pet poo. So our cat, we tend to scoop out the poops from the kitty litter and put them into a bag like this, and it goes into the green waste bin. I don't put these into a home composting system because I find they just sort of shred up and then they look like plastic and they kind of blow around the yard. Some of them are thinner than others. This one is bio bag, and you can kind of see it's pretty translucent. So these ones will break down faster than, say, these much thicker ones. This one's Composter Pack. There's lots of different brands. They tend to need at least sort of 2 or 3 goes through this system before they actually properly break down. Other things that I will compost, so you know, fur, cat fur, dog fur, really good to go in there. I'm trying to avoid anything that's plastic. So when I do my sweeping inside, I'm really conscious of the fact that maybe there is some plastics in there. So particularly if you've got, you know, any synthetic fibers in the house, you know, your couch is synthetic or whatever, which is very hard to avoid, then you know, I might put that in landfill and just not even introduce it to a compostable system at all. So that term compostable, really important. A lot of things will say biodegradable on them, and that just doesn't mean anything in terms of, you know, is it suitable for a compost system. Biodegradable just means it will degrade. It will go from bigger pieces into smaller pieces. And in the case of plastic, that's actually terrible. It's the worst thing that you could have. So, Danny, did you have a question?
I was just wondering if people could tell us other things that they do compost.
Yes, I'd love to know. You can compost all sorts of stuff. Human hair, Danny cuts my hair and we chuck it in the compost. Fingernails, anything that was once alive can be composted. And so that includes things like meat and dairy. As I said, you don't want too much of them. And they are really, really rich in nitrogen, so you've got to balance them out with carbon. One thing I will say is things like chicken manure and pigeon manure, things like that, super high in nitrogen. And also they seem to really get compost cranking. They're really, really good, so I tend to put little bits of it. I wouldn't add, I'd add at least, a bucket full to a compost bin of something like horse manure or sheep manure or elephant manure, those really big animals. But the small animals, it's much richer, so I tend to add smaller bits. So, hopefully that makes sense about filling the bin. So now what needs to happen is, in my case, I've got 2 bins, and I really think that that's probably about the minimum you could have. The thing is, once this is full, it needs to rest, and if I don't have another bin, then what do I do? So the system that I've come to really like is to have 2 bins. This one's always the active, being filled bin number 1, and bin number 2 is right now full of beautiful compost that's ready to go out onto the garden. So basically the way it works is this fills over a period of about 6 to 12 weeks, depending on how fast we're producing stuff, what's happening in the garden, or lots of things coming out. Once this is full, hopefully, fingers crossed, this one's ready to go out. If it's not completely composted, and you probably saw, there's bits of stick in there, there's little bits of eggshell, it doesn't matter, it doesn't have to be perfect, because all we're doing is spreading it on the top of our garden beds and letting it continue to break down. So I'll spread that out really soon, because then that'll make room for me to turn this one into this bin. So this bin always being full, this bin always resting, and I tend to use a fork to do that. It's really hard to get something like a spade or a shovel in, just because there's so many woody bits and things in the way. So also a really good idea to fluff up your compost a little bit to increase that aeration using your fork, and so that's the reason I just sort of leave this one out here. So this one's empty, I turn it in. That's my opportunity to fix any mistakes, any problems. Maybe I got a bit lazy and I didn't put in enough carbon material, or I wasn't watering enough. If it looks dry, I'll add moisture. If it's really stinky and wet, I'll add my newspaper or cardboard or straw. And once then I've turned that in, then that sits and cooks. If we go back to our lasagna analogy, that now needs to bake. And so for 5-6 weeks, something like that, I'll leave the lid on. And really important, I've found, is to put something on the top that kind of indicates, don't touch that, that's resting. Because the worst thing that can happen is someone comes along and then they add fresh stuff on top of it. So annoying, because then they've sort of messed up your system. You're going to have bits of whole banana skins and apple cores in your finished compost. So you can put something really heavy on it to make sure people don't get in there, but that's resting. And then after those 6 weeks where it's cooked for a while, just like a good lasagna, you want to take the covering off and let it dry out a bit, and that actually means that a lot of the excess moisture is driven off, makes it a lot easier to handle. And again, I do a bit of fluffing. Every now and again I come along and I just sort of mix it up a little bit to increase aeration, to mix it, and I haven't had an issue for a very long time, producing good compost this way. Did you have a question, Danny?
Yeah, could you put charcoal or ash in there? Charcoal ash?
Yeah, so I don't have a wood fire, so I don't add those things. So ash is high pH, and so some people like to add it because quite a lot of the things that are going in are acidic, so they feel like it's kind of balancing out. As with everything, I wouldn't add too much. I'd sort of add a little sprinkle on different layers. I wouldn't be cleaning out your fireplace, adding a whole bucket all at once. It could really sort of upset the balance and kill off some of those microorganisms. So what was I going to say? So this is now ready to go, and as I said, I just spread it out on the top. So close to saying something.
Do you want to show the finished product?
Let's show the finished product. So this is now ready to go. No matter how hard we try, there always seems to be little bits of plastic that end up in there. I don't know if it comes in with the horse manure or it's just, off bits of cardboard. Just pick them out when you see them. You don't want to be spreading plastic around the place. Weeds. That's what I wanted to talk about. So some people will ask, can I compost my weeds? So we did a bit of weeding the other day. In general, you don't want to compost weeds. One of the reasons they're so successful is because they're such good survivors. So we've got a real issue with cooch in a particular part of our property, and cooch will survive the composting process, cold composting process. And so you really don't want that stuff getting spread around your garden, particularly in your productive areas. We've managed to eradicate it from there. So I would only ever put cooch, into my green bag or just straight into the council bin. Annual weeds, things that haven't seeded yet and don't have either roots that can shoot new stems or a rhizome, then I will put those into compost if I can be bothered separating it out. But things like soursobs, they've got bulbs that are really, really pervasive. They'll survive a compost. I won't put those in either. So commercial compost can take that kind of stuff because the heat gets so much higher. That is another sort of option that I'll mention. If you find yourself really getting into compost and you want to make even bigger amounts of it and more quickly, then you can use a hot composting system. So in this bay here, we've essentially got layer upon layer upon layer of green material. It all came out of the garden in autumn as we changed over from summer to winter crops. And so, all of the pumpkin leaves, the tomatoes, all the capsicums, all that stuff that's just takes up so much room, layers of that went in, interspersed with layers of horse manure and chicken manure and wet down. So it's exactly the same principle as hot composting. It's all just happening at once. And so once you've done that, once you've built your layers up, you can cover it with a good layer of cardboard. It sinks way down. I've actually topped this up twice. And then I just, every now and again, I'll give it a turn. It's a little bit more labor intensive, but it's going to produce a huge amount of compost ready to go out into the garden in spring. So I tend to do that twice a year, hot compost.
It doesn't need that lid on it. That's just from the other one.
No, that's just from the other one.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, so there's also things like bokashi. Obviously these systems won't work if you're in a really, really small apartment with just a balcony or something like that. These sort of rely on being in contact with the soil. But I really do like that in contact with the soil idea. If you do have a bokashi, the end product still needs to go somewhere. So maybe, you're harvesting the juice and you're using that on your indoor plants. And then, you either give the spent bokashi to someone or put it in a green bin. Worm farms, a lot of the principles, that atom that I've talked about, that applies to worm farms, with the exception of, not putting in citrus and onion. They particularly don't like those kind of things. Tumblers, people often bring up tumblers, which I'm not a really big fan of. Again, you miss that soil contact, and I find they tend to get really, really wet, really, really heavy. Even me, and I consider myself reasonably strong, really struggle to tip it over and actually get it tumbling once it's quite full. And then once you've filled it, what do? It's full, it needs to rest. So you'd have to have a number of tumblers or tumble and then put into an on-ground system. So tumblers aren't the full solution, unfortunately. You think, they're going to be labour saving, but some people make them work in their system, and that's really cool. But I haven't had good experience with them at home or in other people's gardens.
They can work well as part of a system for turning.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep. So just a quick word on turning. Obviously, if you don't have the physical ability or you can't be bothered turning your bin 1 into bin 2, then I'd recommend a 3-bin system. So fill bin 1, let that rest, put a brick on it, stop people putting anything in it. Fill bin 2, do exactly the same thing. Fill bin 3, and then by the time you come back to bin 1, hopefully it's broken down enough that then you can use that compost and start filling that again. So by having that extra bin, it just kind of gives you a bit more time. It gives the compost more of a chance to break down properly I'd love to hear if anyone's got any other top tips for their composting setup. That's pretty much how we do it here, and we've been composting for years and years, and we don't actually have to buy in compost, which is really nice. We manage to sort of cycle it all around, and that's by sending as little as possible off-site, just those really hard woody things that are just too tricky. Any other questions, Danny?
No, but we'll give people an opportunity to put some questions through. If you have, you can type them in the comments now for us. Otherwise, we can also answer any typed questions by typing back to them.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, as I mentioned, having a rake, a compost fork or a mulch fork is really, really useful for turning. For years and years, I just used a regular old garden fork, but you can see the benefit of having those extra tines. Things tend not to fall off, but they are quite expensive, so that's a bit of an investment. If you find yourself composting a lot, you might want to invest. You really need very little equipment in order to do good composting. Just having bays or bins like this works really well. And I should say, you can pretty them up. They don't have to look like these ugly things. When we were living at my mum's place, we used to wrap them in hessian to make them look a bit prettier. You can also use things like the split bamboo to sort of hide them, and they don't have to be tucked away in the corner like this. I really like to have all of my composting stuff set up around me, but you could have them spread throughout your garden. And actually the benefit of that is when the good nutrients go out and the water that you're putting on it, it actually benefits the plants that are around it. So under a mature tree or near some fruit trees would be a really good spot. You can move them around your garden as you see fit. One last one I wanted to talk about before we finish is in-ground composting or in-ground worm farming. So say you've got a bucket like this, you can actually poke or drill a lot of holes in them and submerge that into a garden bed or into your veggie patch or into your wicking bed, and just put scraps in there as well as your carbon materials, and then worms will come from outside of the bucket, from the soil inside, and actually feed on them, drag those nutrients out. And the best thing about it is, unlike worm farms that sit above ground that just get incredibly hot in summer, the worms can always escape and be in that cool soil where it's cool, dark, and just a perfect spot for them. So having a lid on it, or a plate or a bit of slate, something like that, just to stop birds getting in there, that's really good. But I really like that system. Yes, Danny.
There's similar systems for dog poo as well in ground, and I just wanted to do a quick reiterate that the system we have, the 2-bay, is a 2-bay cold compost, and behind Sam is the hot compost all at once. Yeah.
Yes. So thanks for joining me. Hopefully you found that useful and got some good tips and tricks out of it. Thanks again to Resilient South and to the NRM board for supporting this, and acknowledging that I'm here on beautiful Ghana land. So we'll see you in the next one.